Welcome to Mastering the Next, a cutting-edge podcast that explores the future of graduate, online, and non-traditional education through the lens of AI and technology. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Lutsky, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451. Join me every 2 weeks for discussions with some of the thought leaders shaping the future of graduate enrollment management through technology. Mastering the Next is a part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform that helps institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Dr. Bil Leipold, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Services and Experience at Rutgers University-Newark, to explore the critical topic of social justice in graduate enrollment management. In today's higher education landscape, it can be challenging for enrollment managers to develop strategies and initiatives that ensure equity and inclusivity within graduate programs. Dr. Leipold will shed light on the importance of creating a more just and accessible academic environment for all students and how these efforts are transforming higher education. Bill, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, Ray, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, it's an honor to have you. I always like to start with the question, what's next? So what's next for social justice in graduate enrollment management at Rutgers University-Newark?
I'm glad you asked that question. So, as you know, the world kind of got turned over a little bit when it came to the conversations of social justice, especially affirmative action in the Supreme Court. The conversations at Rutgers University-Newark have been in conversations for a long time. We are lucky to have been led by Dr. Nancy Cantor as our chancellor, who came in about a decade ago. And the conversation turned immediately to how do we create opportunity, access, and affordability for not just undergraduate students, but for graduate students. And we started to look at how we provide services to students in that way, as well as looking at our recruitment and having conversations around how we prepare undergraduates to seek graduate programs, but also talk about how we deal with new incoming graduate students. So I say all that to provide you that framework that our conversation at Rutgers Newark has been, one, always to find top talent. Finding the top talented graduate students in master's programs, PhD programs has always been a priority for this institution. It didn't just occur when Nancy Cantor arrived, but it accelerated in different ways when Nancy was with us. And I say with us because Nancy has since moved on to be the president of Hunter College. We love her and we will miss her, but we wish her well in her new position. But we have been focused a lot on how do we define the concepts of social justice, diversity, and inclusion at Rutgers University-Newark. We are lucky to have been one of the top diverse institutions for the past 25 years. We led the way for several years as the first and number one diverse institution. So we don't have a majority on campus. Our student population is extremely diverse, and including students who identify as white, often identify as Egyptian, may have been immigrants from a number of our different areas. So the conversation about working at this institution is a privilege, and it's a dream to be able to work with a diverse student population, and our graduate students are among the top of that. So the conversations have always been, how do we support our students, graduate students, from the moment that they're recruited the whole way through their completion? So, and obviously dealing with master's students is a little different than dealing with doctoral students. We are a research institution, so our faculty have a love for their students in the doctoral programs, but we also have really important master's programs that seek to serve the larger good across the globe. I'm thinking of our master's programs so global in so many different ways. So when we think about graduate students, we think about, one, how do we support funding in that space to be able to do that? We think about services when they arrive, from what type of items do we need to do with the Office of International Student Services to make sure that students feel comfortable? How are we dealing with mental health issues in graduate students specifically? We've all worked in higher education a long time to know that students who are on the doctoral program, when they come in through the cohort model, they get through classes with no problem. It's when they get into that exam and dissertation phase that everybody starts to then deal with the various different doubts that creep in with writing, conversations about no one's gone through this but me, all those kind of items that kind of can play together. But then we're also dealing with a myriad of different mental health items that kind of pop in, especially post-COVID, in terms of that conversation. We work very closely with our graduate recruitment as well as our graduate onboarding with our Office of Student and Disability Services. We're in the midst of changing that name right now. So hopefully by the time this airs, it'll come up with a different name that'll speak more to kind of where we are in the social justice phase at this particular point. And the conversation around social justice is really in the curricula and in the writing in terms of being able to integrate social justice concepts, more concepts of diverse experiences into the classroom, as well as the examples and the books that we're reading, but more so how do we engage conversation and facilitate conversation in the classrooms where we're honoring lived experiences, because that's really important for us. And we'll get into that a little bit more, the lived experiences that the students bring to our classrooms, especially on the graduate side, only add to the literature that's out there and add to the larger global context that I think we all need to read in this space, especially if you're following the conversation that more diverse means more creative, more success, and really a better way of engaging skills, knowledge, and abilities in the workforce, no matter where you work, because you're learning and engaging from folks with different perspectives.
That's so important, and absolutely thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, access, all the things you mentioned. And I would like to talk about the national landscape. But first, I want to kind of double click on some of the things you said and the priorities from Dr. Cantor, who was president of Syracuse University right after I graduated and has done a lot of great work. But what's going on now at Rutgers University-Newark? Are there specific initiatives you could call out about some of the points you mentioned, either about access or around recruitment? Are there things you can share that are like specific initiatives that maybe a listener could think about implementing themselves?
So I would be remiss if I didn't actually speak about our law school. The law school at Rutgers University is fairly well known, and they were one of the first law schools to create a minority student program space for students and really diversify the pipeline for folks in the legal space. And so we have this amazing program that has been historic, have incredible graduates that continue to give back to that space. So the minority student program in the law school is an amazing space where we're seeing mentorship play out. We're seeing onboarding the first years of L1s, we call them L1s, the first year of law school, conversations around how are we helping folks write? How are we helping folks adjust? How are we helping folks find internships? So the MSP program is really important. The other things that we're doing, we're spending a lot of time, and I think this is critically important. We're spending a lot of time encouraging our undergraduates to think about graduate work. And the reason why I say that is because we have this immensely talented undergraduate student population that doesn't often think about, well, what's next in terms of graduate work? They often think in terms of career. We spend a lot of time, and we have amazing BA/MA programs or BSMA programs, accelerated programs, where you can get your graduate degree in 5 years and your undergraduate degree together. So, there's a talented, amazing, diverse student body that we're like, you really can excel in this space, and let's cultivate that time to be able to do that. We've also been working with the Kellogg Foundation to create our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, or we call it TRHT. It is restorative justice circles, conversations in the community, and we really work with our graduate students to take part in TRHT so that we can talk about not just what's happening now, but what's happening historically and kind of bringing their lived experiences into that space. The other thing that we were able to work on undergraduate-wise, which is now evolving into graduate, is what we call NJ STEP and or Mountain View. We are very happy to be partnering with Raritan Valley Community College in providing coursework for folks who are incarcerated. That's really important in terms of being able to provide education and outreach, but the folks should be formerly incarcerated. They're welcome on campus. And so we have what we call our Mountain View program. And a number of those students are amazing undergrads that we then turn around and say, you need to go to public administration, or you need to enroll in our Masters of Criminal Justice. Or so the conversation is, we're adding a different lived experience into the graduate programs that we think is super, super important. Rutgers University-Newark is known also for its social work program. We have an amazing social work program who is super involved in our anchor work in terms of being involved in Newark, Greater Newark and Essex County, in terms of their outreach, their programming, that kind of information. Rutgers University-Newark also has a large number of undocumented or documented students. That also extends to our graduate population. And so we have a number of those students who bring tons of lived experience, that we're here because they're amazingly talented. They deserve to be here. And so that conversation for us is really important on the graduate side. But the push of all the conversations around social justice really come from our graduate student government space. They are super active. They work very closely with student affairs and the academic side, talking about the student experience on campus and kind of where they hold us accountable for where we do really well and items we need to improve on. And so right now we're dealing with the issue of how do we provide more and inclusive services to our trans student population. And, they're coming to us mirroring other institutions from Michigan to NYU and asking us why certain things don't exist on campus for us. And so we're really kind of working with our Intercultural Resource Center, the Office of the Chancellor, to really listen, engage the student population, and understand what we need to do differently to support and make sure that this environment is one in which they can engage and learn, and really just focus on engaging and learning, because everything around them should be a safer space for them to be expressive and be where they need to be as their authentic self. So those are some of the things that we've been working on and have been really engaged with over the past couple of years.
That's incredible. And it brings up a larger question when you talk about trans students and their experiences in graduate school. Let's talk about DACA recipients. This is part of a national dialogue that's going on right now that sort of is wrapped up in the heading of DEIB programs in public education in particular. And it's no secret that some states are moving in the opposite direction. They're eliminating these programs. They're mandating funding not be provided for these programs. What do you think of this dialogue, and where do you think it's going to lead? And has it affected your work at Rutgers Newark at all?
So I will start off with, I think this conversation has become so political, and it's become, for me, I can't speak for others, I can only say for me, it dismisses the lived experience of everybody on campus. So in this conversation, to take away cultural institutions, in the conversation to erase history or rewrite history in different ways where it makes folks feel comfortable, to me is not a space of growth. I think we have learned in higher education time and time again that being uncomfortable actually leads to learning. And being uncomfortable, I think, helps folks to create language and make meaning of what it means to be uncomfortable. We can do that from privilege. We can do that from, I don't understand this content, I need to learn it. I'm going to share with you, I hate math. I am not good at statistics. So sitting in that class makes me very uncomfortable. So what are we supposed to do now when I feel uncomfortable in math? And so that question for me is a question I think it's become so politically charged. And I think we've co-opted graduate terms and graduate language. Critical race theory is a theory. It's a critical theory that is often used in mostly upper level undergraduate courses, master's programs, and PhD programs. So I think the conversation is we've kind of lost sight of what some of the teachings are about. How are we engaging folks to think critically? I am not in the belief that we're doing indoctrination. That's my opinion. My opinion is the more students dialogue and they learn from each other their lived experience, they're more willing to ask questions, to better understand. And that's why, for me, I love Rutgers Newark, because the diversity in the classroom, most of us are facilitators, and the students are educating each other on their own lived experience and how they're making meaning of the information we're teaching, and how they're applying their lived experience to a theory, a history, a conversation that's different, especially on the graduate area. That's where critical conversations and critical thinking happens in different ways, and synthesizing a number of kind of items to say, this makes sense for me, this doesn't. And I think, not having DEI in the space, I think you minimize the critical conversations that need to happen of each other. I don't think you're engaging the creative spirit either. I'm going to say that very clearly. I will speak from my own personal experience. My undergraduate experience was very different than most. And there was not an LGBTQ plus organization on my campus. And being one of the first out gay folks on campus, there was no place to go. And my safe space were with our cultural centers on campus. I found comfort and I found great relationships with people who they're not similar experiences, but there was at least an understanding of some experience in that space. And if those cultural spaces didn't exist, I don't know where I would have been. I don't know who I would have been encouraged by in lots of different ways. So for me, I found a sense of belonging. And we all know from theory that when students belong on campus, they tend to thrive, they tend to excel. And I think that DEI initiatives allow folks to, 1, be seen, 2, be heard, and 3, flourish, because you're looking for those spaces and those mentors. And I think that's what DEI does in ways that we haven't talked about. And I think by saying we can't do those, folks cannot see themselves now at institutions, and folks aren't finding those spaces of comfort and encouragement. And I worry about what that looks like for a student, a faculty member, and or specifically a graduate student who's struggling to write their dissertation, because that connection on the graduate level is so critical, especially with a mentor or a space to stop in, to find that sense of belonging and that sense of identification on campus.
Hey there, it's Mallory, Chief Strategist of Enrollify. Higher ed is facing a leadership crisis. The demands on today's college and university leaders are skyrocketing, and talent is leaving the industry at an unprecedented rate. New leaders like you are emerging, but no one is getting the proper training to be successful. Well, Enrollify is here to change that. Our new course, Lessons in Leadership, taught by Dr. Carrie Phillips, will prepare you to be a confident, empathetic, and effective leader. From systems thinking to adaptive leadership, building culture to handling difficult decisions, this comprehensive online course is perfect for new and aspiring leaders. Don't wait. The course starts September 9th, and for a lucky group of 26 students, we have the option to add interactive sessions with Dr. Phillips for personalized guidance. Visit Enrollify.org to learn more.
Thanks for sharing your personal story. And I imagine if you're listening to this podcast, you may be able to relate in some way to Dr. Leipold's story there. And thinking about the impact on the individual, and that being pretty clear, at an institutional level, how do you go about measuring the impact of the social justice initiatives you're talking about related to graduate students specifically? And what metrics would you say would be the most meaningful?
So, it's interesting because we have really moved to look at APLU, and we've looked at NACUBO, and we've kind of looked at a conversation with the Bill Gates Foundation, Melinda Bill Gates Foundation, around equity leadership and how is voice encouraged? How are we making decisions? And how are we engaging others? And we are really paying attention to how are we looking at resources? How are we engaging resources across the campus? So I think we have gone through a really transformational kind of space looking at our equity leadership kind of model. And how does that play out, not just at the chancellor level, but also in graduate spaces and undergraduate spaces. And that doesn't often happen in graduate level education. Graduate level education tends to be very faculty focused and driven. And that's great, because that's why we have institutions of higher education. That's why we have critical thinking. But I think one of the things we realized is being able to magnify and lift up the graduate student voice is critically important to better understanding their student experience, their lived experience, and what is needed by graduate students in order to be successful. Some of those items are personal in nature, and that's where we get into places like providing more mental health resources or providing a care team to deal with a number of items that might pop up because you might be dealing with a medical issue or you might be dealing with a family emergency. But then there are other spaces that we could talk about what does housing look like for graduate students that's different than undergraduate students because their work is different. And so what do the gathering spaces look like in those areas for graduate students? What are visitor rights for residence halls, graduate students differently than undergraduate students? And I say that because our undergraduates live here for 9 months and our graduate students live here for 12 months, and it's their space to live. It's their 12-month contract. They're resident. It's a very different experience. So I think lots of conversations for me are about, in this equity leadership model, is how do we apply and how do we continue to engage across our leadership team with graduate students to better understand and magnify and listen. We all joke about the fact, and in my head, I'm replaying an incident. We're replaying an incident where, the conversation is, as students were talking to us, we had to go back to a moment and be like, we were just there not too long ago. And that conversation means we all earned our master's degrees or our doctoral degrees in different ways. But some of the same issues kind of same applied. And how did that happen and how did that make us feel? So I think it's being able to go back and listen, engage, empathize, and not always say, I have the answer, but be honest in terms of acknowledging what has been said or what has been shared. And then asking that individual to be part of the solution or process so that we're all learning together as opposed to it's one person's problem to solve.
It's interesting. It kind of makes me think about the difference between diversity and equity, where like diversity is being asked to the dance, but equity is being asked to dance, to be a part of what's going on and have their voice, have their participation be there, and not just sort of tokenizing people's experiences. I want to go back to something you mentioned. I think it's really interesting, talking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others. Can you discuss a little more about those kinds of partnerships to advance social justice at Rutgers, Newark, and how would you suggest a listener go about trying to form those kinds of partnerships for their own campus community?
First of all, part of where we walked into was because we had Nancy as a leader. And I say that Dr. Cantor came into a space, she came with relationships already in play, and folks knew what her values and what she was about. And so with those experiences and with her lived experience, with her gravitas, and I say that in a great way because she's like, we need to do X. And so the bottom line here is we would go into those spaces. We also took opportunities through the APLU. We took opportunities through ASCU. We took opportunities through NACUBO to really look and explore how we could engage with grants, how we could engage with new programs that were coming about. So we were able to focus in on opportunities, whether it was with the Kellogg Foundation, whether it was with the Panasonic, whether it was with President's Alliance, which Chancellor Cantor is a co-chair of, all those items, and I know I'm missing a whole bunch. The reality here is they were important to who we were, but they were also important to learning from others. Part of what was so important about being part of those organizations was being able to understand what a UCLA, a University of Michigan, a UMBC, the conversation around Georgia State, if we're looking at the University of Akron, the reality here is we're learning from other institutions and that we're not doing this work alone. We're doing this work in concert and collaboration with others. And that one of the things that I was going to repeat, was going to come back and say, is that the one thing we've learned over and over at Rutgers Newark is we are not the experts in the room. We are all learning together. And so that means when we're working in Newark as a community, or if we're working in Essex County as a community, the reality is we're coming in, but we're not the experts about where folks live. We're not the experts about where people are. And we're not the experts on DEI, but we are collaborators on DEI. And how can we learn from each other while everybody's bringing their own voice to that space? And so those are very important values for us in those spaces. And I would say to you, having Nancy as a leader was helpful in making some inways to that. But we've also now been able to establish ourselves as an institution in that space. So with Nancy moving on, we still have the ability and all the experience that she helped us to have to continue to be full members in those spaces and learn differently than we did when she was here.
So it keeps it sustainable even after a dynamic leader begins the process. It becomes a part of the soul of the institution, which is really interesting and gratifying to hear. I always like to end by asking guests to look into the future and use your crystal ball and kind of share, how do you see universities prioritizing social justice in their graduate enrollment practices in the future? You're clearly doing a lot of innovative things. Where is this going for graduate enrollment nationwide?
So here's the interesting space with graduate enrollment. Similar to undergraduate enrollment, there is more hunger for more online programs, more hybrid experiences, more fully online experiences. And I think that pushes the conversation of DEI in a whole different direction that we have yet to fully understand. I think the graduate experience has been, for a long time, fully integrated in a classroom or in-person kind of conversation. And I think prior to COVID, there was the evolution of online education and or weekend programs. I think after COVID, everything exploded. And that our students in graduate programs want options. They want what's available to them when they want it. And in that space, I think that challenges institutions of thinking about how do they do DEI differently, because everything relied on an in-person conversation or in-person connections. So I think, one, that's going to be a challenge for us moving forward. I think, two, we are getting to an interesting space where everybody knows that the enrollment cliff is coming. Since 2008, babies just haven't been born in the same numbers prior to 2008. And folks have found jobs. So everybody knows, too, the reality is graduate programs tend to really grow during economic downturns and tend to kind of contract a little bit during economic celebrations. I think in this particular moment, we have a lot of folks who don't think graduate education is needed anymore because they found jobs with higher pay, and they found a little bit different. So I think we're in a new evolution of how do we connect specifically our master's degree outcomes to employment outcomes in ways that we haven't before. And how do you do that and explain that your learning around DEI is part of what you bring now as a skill, knowledge, and ability to a global product? I think before, business schools were amazing about doing that, and global programs were great about doing that. But I think other folks are starting now needing to catch up in those spaces. I think a lot of conversation, crystal ball wise, is people are going to want to understand what is the value attached to graduate education. Folks understand it when I think we talk about law school, medical school, but I think the conversation for humanities and from other kind of different programs, it's going to be a new challenge because folks aren't willing to pay lots of money anymore and not have something in return and see the trajectory career-wise afterwards. So I think that's just a new evolution about what does that look like. But I think the conversation that students are asking differently that they didn't ask before is great. I'm going to go to that corporation, but how will I, as a person with this intersectionality of X, Y, and Z, fit into that corporation? Because they're now looking at graduate programs to understand or being able to translate that in some of those conversations with career spaces and or those items. And I do think whatever happens in the emerging next 8 years with politics is going to have a large impact on higher education.
Time will tell. And when it does, we hope to have you back to talk more about this topic. Dr. Bil Leipold, Associate Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Services and Experience at Rutgers University-Newark. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Oh, Ray, thank you. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it.
The Mastering the Next podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Artis Cadieux, J.C. Bonilla, Mallory Wilsey, Brendan Henkel, Brian Gross, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.